So last week I was over at the Disneyland Resort for a day off, and I went to Pirates of the Caribbean to see if they modified it a bit just to promote this new movie. There was that big promotional stunt that they did with Johnny Depp at the ride as Captain Jack Sparrow, but I wanted to see if they modified the ride itself, just like they've done with the past movies to promote this new one. And no, there's nothing new. It's just the same modifications that's been there for 11 years. This is my review for the 5th entry in the Pirates of the Caribbean series, Pirates of the Caribbean. Huh. Weird, okay. Didn't do that last time I said the title. But anyway, this is the 5th movie. It takes place about 6 years after the events of On Stranger Tides, and don't really expect much from that movie to pop up in this one. There are a few elements in it, like the Black Pearl being in a bottle, Hector Barbosa being captain of the Queen Anne's Revenge. Minimal things just for the sake of continuity, but nothing big really pops up from the last movie. But anyway, this movie begins with a Jack Sparrow who is very much a shadow of his former self. He's completely shit-faced, he's resorted to robbing banks unsuccessfully, a lot of what's left of his crew hate him, so basically he's just down on his luck and not the once grand pirate that he was. Unfortunately, things don't get any better once he accidentally is responsible for the freedom of this ghost crew led by Captain Salazar, played by Javier Bardem, who's had history with Jack Sparrow in the past. So Salazar is on a quest for revenge. Jack Sparrow finds out that he needs to find the Triton of Poseidon, which could end the curse of Captain Salazar and pretty much stop him from being dead forever. And accompanying him on his adventure, we have a young astronomer named Karina, and a young man named Henry Turner, who he himself wants the Triton for his own personal needs. And if you can tell by the last name, you might know what his motivation is. Every time I've seen a trailer for this movie, I kept thinking to myself, this looks like it's going to be the exact same shit as we saw in the sequels. But I'm still hopeful. I'm still optimistic that this could be the one, because let's do a brief history of the Pirates movies. I've already reviewed them on this channel, but just as a brief history, I love Curse of the Black Pearl. I think it's an adventure film that's almost on the level of Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's exciting, it's funny, the characters are great, it's well paced. I just love it all around. And then when we get into the sequels, this is when things get a little messy. I really like Dead Man's Chest, even though it was complicated, more complicated than it needed to be. I thought it had some great designs with Davy Jones and his crew. Jack Sparrow's still very funny. There are a bunch of fantastic action scenes and funny moments, and every scene with the Kraken is an A+ scene in that movie. The third movie, At World's End, is a total clusterfuck. There are way too many plot points going on. Everyone's betraying each other and then forgiving each other at the snap of a finger, and it's almost 3 goddamn hours long. While it did have some good moments here and there, on the whole, not very good. It's a bad movie. On Stranger Tides, oh yeah, there was a 4th one. But joking aside, it was more like what the series should be, but it once again is more complicated than it needs to be in terms of its plot. It has a lot of pointless scenes, and overall, it's just not that imaginative. It's actually downright forgettable. This movie had the potential to be the best one because you got a change in directors, you got a different writer on board, and it's a much shorter movie, and given how Disney's really improved with a lot of other properties like Marvel, Star Wars, and their own Disney animation lineup, Pirates of the Caribbean should be getting back on the right track. This could easily be the best one of the series. But no, it's not. Once again, it's the exact same movie that we got with the past sequels. And it's weird because it has all the elements that I wanted, like a shorter runtime, a more simple story, and the fact that it's a standalone movie once again. So where exactly did it go wrong? Well, let me talk about the good stuff first of all. It is still a fun movie, even though I'm not a big fan of the last two sequels. There's no Pirates of the Caribbean movie that I see that I downright hate. They all have really fun action sequences, and this one has action scenes that are more impressive than on Stranger Tides. They're a tad more memorable, mainly with the big climax at the end. And with that bank robbing sequence that I talked about in my sneak peek review, it is fun, more inventive than anything in On Stranger Tides. But watching it again, and especially within context of everything else, it doesn't hold up as well as it does by itself when you watch it just by itself. But regardless, it's fun in that really stupid, over-the-top kind of way. The music is still really good. Even though Hans Zimmer's not doing the score this time around, I'm glad that they still keep the sound of the Pirates of the Caribbean music and not do an entirely different sounding score. It's like if they decide to do a completely different type of score for the next Indiana Jones movie. It's just, you can't really have pirates without this kind of music. So the music really works, and Javier Bardem is a really fun villain. He's more memorable than Ian McShane was as Blackbeard, and definitely more memorable than Cutler Beckett. But ultimately, I don't feel like he has that much to work with. He's just kind of a slimy villain who has very menacing moments. He's much more menacing than Blackbeard, because Salazar carries this menace throughout the whole movie. But he did have some problems, one of which is the special effects with him. Mainly the CGI hair that's floating around. The whole deal with his crew is that when they're brought back to life as, let's face it, zombies, they take in whatever killed them. Like, for example, there's some of his crew that are missing their heads, or there's a big hole in their chest. If that's how they died, they keep that thing. And in the case of Salazar, he drowned, and so he always has this effect as if he's always underwater. And I get it, but the effect of his waving hair back and forth, it just, I don't know, it looks really bad. It just doesn't really work all that well. It looked fine when in the trailers, but watching it on a big screen for 2 hours, I don't know. There is another problem that I have with Salazar, but I'll get back to that once I finish listing off the positives. The best character in this movie is played by Kea Scodelario. She's the most interesting character in this movie because she's an astronomer. She's the only one next to Javier Bardem who has the most charisma in terms of your new characters. And she's vital to the plot. She's one of the main aspects of it. And I thought she really played well with some of the other characters. Although there is a running joke throughout the whole movie where everyone accuses her of being a witch. The first few times it's amusing, but after a while it's just like, yes, we get it. This is the 18th century. Women are not supposed to be this smart or take on professions that are usually male-dominated. We get it. Move along. Now let's talk about the bad or the mediocre. One thing that just never changes with these sequels is that each of these sequels, except for At World's End, have what should be a very simple, straightforward plot, but for some reason, it's jam-packed with so many pointless elements, or just too many elements, that makes it more complicated than it needs to be. Like on Stranger Tides, there are just many pointless elements in this movie. We have a character who's a real witch, who you've seen in the trailers, that goes, "The dead have taken command of the sea. They're searching for a pearl, a girl, and a sparrow." That character goes nowhere. There's a pointless scene involving Jack Sparrow and a wedding. I'll just leave it at that. There's a really pointless cameo that really feels forced and out of place. And even the character of Henry Turner has no real purpose of being in this movie. With him and his whole subplot, you could cut it out and you wouldn't have missed a thing. His story arc barely plays into the movie at all. Now, as I said, a lot of the action scenes are fun to watch, but there's one scene in this movie that I thought was going to be really cool and ended up being really underwhelming. There's a scene where Jack Sparrow, Kalina, and Henry Turner are being attacked by these zombie sharks that are under the control of Captain Salazar. And you'd think a scene with zombie sharks would be the coolest thing in the world, because how could you go wrong? But it ends up being very underwhelming. It goes by quick, it's not all that creative, and it's just sort of a lesser version of the Kraken scenes in Dead Man's Chest, which was my favorite part of that whole second movie. And there's also a lot of bad CG in this movie. Not to the extent where you go, oh my god, that looks so terrible, like the pixelating effects in Transformers 4, but more like in a, wow, that's really a CG effect, or that looks fake. I mentioned Salazar's hair, but there's also a lot of painfully obvious green screen effects whenever the characters are on board their ships. And when you take into consideration the other movies, especially the ones that Gore Verbinski directed, you believe that they were on the ocean. You believe that they were actually on a ship, on real water. This one just has a bunch of painfully obvious green screen effects. It just looks fake. It doesn't look convincing in the slightest. Now, my two biggest problems of this movie have to involve the antagonist and the protagonist. Let's start with Salazar. The whole backstory of Salazar is that he was this captain of the Spanish Royal Navy who hunted down pirates before being killed himself. And it's really hard to see this guy as a villain because pirates are scumbags already. They're criminals, thieves. So it's a bit difficult to have sympathy for pirates when the guy going after them was already set on killing off all pirates in the world to begin with. It's just like in At World's End. When we're supposed to feel sympathy or sorrow that this could be the end of all pirates, it's like, that's actually more of a good thing. So that's something that was a little hard to get behind. And the last thing that irritated me, I hate to say it, but it's Captain Jack Sparrow. I said in my preview that Johnny Depp still does a good job as Jack Sparrow, but again, that was the preview. This is the first movie where, from beginning to end, I honestly got sick of Jack Sparrow because at this point, he's become a true caricature of himself. When you watch the first Pirates of the Caribbean movie, he had his dumb moments here and there, but you could also tell that he was very clever. He would do all of these things and get into all of these situations like a fool, but he would always know better. He would always plan ahead and find a way to resolve this situation or get out of it intact. Here, he is a complete fool, and it's just, it's tiring to watch. And I think the big problem is that throughout these sequels, Jack Sparrow gets no character development. They start him off with something. Like in this movie, they start him off as a pirate who's down on his luck. He's not in his glory days. That's a good setup for some character development. So we get from A to B to C. But this movie never really does that. We get to A, we start delving into B, and then we just go back to A. There's no character development with Jack Sparrow, and I think he just needs to start growing as a character. Let's take an example of another big cultural phenomenon in terms of films. Tony Stark, played by Robert Downey Jr. We all love him in the first Iron Man and the Avengers because he's very cocky, full of himself, funny. But Tony Stark grows as the Marvel Cinematic Universe progresses. He starts to take responsibility for his actions more, like we see in Civil War and even Iron Man 3 to an extent. And he just grows as a character. He becomes more mature, especially considering where he first started in Iron Man 1. And I'm not asking for a lot of character development, like something really deep for Jack Sparrow, but just enough to where he's not a cartoon or where you roll your eyes whenever he does something stupid. I also didn't find this movie as funny as the others. There is one really great funny moment in this movie involving a guillotine. I'll just leave it at that because it's worth seeing for yourself rather than me explaining it to you. But a lot of the slapstick humor just didn't work because it was tiring, and then there are a lot of really tasteless jokes in this movie, and they're all directed towards Karina specifically. If you've seen the official trailer for this movie, you probably know the jokes that I'm talking about, and I thought they were tasteless in the trailer, and they're still tasteless in this movie. So in the end, I really wanted to love this movie, and there were parts in it that I did like, but I can't really say I was disappointed. This is pretty much exactly what I imagined this movie was going to be. Again, it had some really good moments to it. The action's fun, I like some of the characters, but it's just very underwhelming. If you've seen the other sequels, you've pretty much seen this one, and it doesn't really do anything special from the other Pirates of the Caribbean movies. So I'm gonna say watch this at your own risk. If you're still a fan of these movies, and you love the other sequels, then there's no stopping you from going to see this one. Chances are you've already seen it and loved it. And hey, good for you. I'm not gonna criticize you at all for loving this movie. But if you've grown tired of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, then this is not worth your time. Maybe it's worth renting when it comes out on Blu-ray or digital, but having to go to the theater to see it, it's not worth your time at all. I will say, though, it is the shortest of all the movies. So if you're worried about this movie being 2.5 hours or more, then you can relax knowing that this is only 2 hours and 9 minutes. I don't think I'll ever watch this again. If it comes on TV, I'll watch some of it, but I have no desire to watch this or even own it. And yeah, that's all I have to say. Oh, you know what? The last thing I'll say is that when I saw this movie, they showed a trailer for Star Wars The Last Jedi. And the one thing that I thought to myself was, if they didn't push back The Last Jedi to December and left it at its original release date, which is this weekend, I could have been reviewing The Last Jedi now instead of this movie. So disappointing. But anyway, that's my review for Pirates of the Caribbean. Still love that voice from the ride. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this review. Leave a comment down below and tell me what your thoughts are on the movie, if and when you've seen it. How does it compare to the other Pirates movies? And as always, this is the real Mr. Robinson telling you, there is only one.